Imagine if an attacker got access to your username and password for an application or for your AWS console. What are the things they're going to be able to do with that access? In this video, we're going to be talking about identification and authentication failure, what it is, where you can find it in AWS, and things that you can do to prevent it. When you're trying to access an application, something like say Facebook or Twitter, or even your AWS console, you do need a username and password or login details. Now, if that application is hosted in cloud and internet facing and also has weak authentication in place for your login details, an attacker can take over that cloud hosted application and misuse it. Now, this gives birth to our villain con identity, identification and authentication failure. Identification and authentication failure, or con identity, normally occurs when identification, authentication, and session management is not done correctly. Now, this does leave your cloud-hosted application unprotected. An attacker can then take over your cloud-hosted application and gain access to things like your username, password, session tokens, and take over an identity either permanently or temporarily. Once an attacker takes over your identity, they do really become like a con artist, and they can use that assumed identity to take all the actions that you have permissions for. Now, if identification and authentication failure in cloud sounds a little bit familiar, you're not wrong. It does have its origin in the OAuth's top 10 for application security. It used to be called broken authentication back in 2017, and then it was renamed to identification and authentication failure in 2021 for app security. Identification and authentication failure can happen because of a couple of reasons. First, insufficient credential management. Now, this is when you have a weak username, password, or hashing technique, and this allows the attacker to actually abuse these weak credentials to take over your account. The second one is insufficient session management. Now, a session is a connection between a client and an application, and it is issued by the application, and it's unique to the identity. Now, if these sessions are not managed appropriately, it can compromise your application. Now, there are three main ways that an attacker can exploit identification and authentication failure: credential stuffing, brute force access, and session hijacking. Now, brute force access is when an attacker chooses to use some common username and passwords through an automated script until the right one is found. Now, they may find these usernames and passwords through another data breach that's been made available on the internet. Now, credential stuffing is when an attacker chooses to use an automated tool and known username and passwords for a user that they may have found on a website like say Have I Been Pawned or any other domain, and try that on another domain. Now, this normally works when a user has been reusing the same passwords in various different places.
Don't you dare. Don't you dare.
Now, session hijacking is exactly what it sounds like when an attacker chooses to hijack a session ID. So pretty much take over someone's session ID by doing things like traffic sniffing. And a session ID is normally what is allocated to a user when they first log in, just so that they don't have to re-log in again.
Mind if I see some identification?
Now, identification and authentication failure, or con identity, is really quite the bad villain in AWS. If someone gets access to administrator privileges in AWS, they can gain access to a lot of information. They can get access to sensitive data, commit fraud, money laundering, and a lot more. One of the common places in AWS where you can find con identity is compute service EC2.
Yeah, that sounds bad.
Now, when you host an application on EC2, you're normally putting in things like a firewall or a security group to protect it. Now, when these applications are internet facing and also don't have good authentication in place, they can definitely lead to identification and authentication failures. Now, another place that you would find con identity in AWS is AWS IAM user and root user with weak credentials. Now, an AWS IAM user is an identity that is provided to an application or a user, and it's allowed different roles and permissions. The root user is usually your first account that you create on AWS, and it's got administrative privileges to all your services and resources. Now, normally you would not use your root user for your everyday task in AWS. If you choose to do that, or if you do have weak credentials for your AWS IAM accounts with no multi-factor authentication, then you'll certainly be facing con identity. Now, another place in AWS that you can find con identity is the AWS API Gateway with weak credentials. Now, an API is really like a front door to an application, and it allows other users and applications to interact with it. In AWS, you have API Gateway, which is a fully managed service that they offer, and it allows developers to create, monitor, publish, and scale any application. Now, if this API gateway has weak credentials, then you can definitely have identification and authentication failure. Now, we know what corn identity is. We know that it's bad, and we know the places that it hides in AWS. So what can we do to stop corn identity or prevent identification and authentication failure? The first thing is quite simple. Enforce login on all your applications. So with each AWS application that you're hosting, make sure you've got strong username, password, and multi-factor authentication in place. This will go a long way in preventing corn identity. Another thing you can do to stop corn identity is use standard-based authentication and authorization frameworks. You can have strong authentication in place by using industry standard-based frameworks like OpenID and OAuth to make sure that your authorized users can access all applications securely and also through a single set of credentials. Now you're enforcing login across all your application and you're using industry standard-based frameworks. Another good idea to protect yourself against corn identity is always to pen test all your applications, just to make sure that if there are any security gaps, you do find them. Hope you've enjoyed this video. Now you know what corn identity is, where it hides in AWS, and what you can do to stop it. Now that you've tackled corn identity, go ahead and look at our other villains and what you can do to stop them.